The train rattled westward through mountains that grew wilder with every mile, and Silas Whitfield pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the passenger car window, watching civilization dissolve into wilderness. 3 days he had been traveling. 3 days since he locked the door of his rented room in Philadelphia for the last time, left the key with the landlady, and walked to the station carrying everything he owned in a single leather valise. 27 years old, orphan, former school teacher, current fool. He pulled the letter from his breast pocket and read it again, though by now he had memorized every word, every curve of the handwriting, every place where the ink had smudged as if the writer's hand had trembled. Miss B. Calloway of Cradle Creek, Virginia, had answered his response to her advertisement with a letter so beautiful it had cracked something open in his chest that he had spent his whole life trying to keep sealed shut. She wrote about loneliness the way a poet writes about weather, not as complaint, but as landscape. She described mountain mornings when mist clung to the ridge lines like ghosts reluctant to leave, and evenings when the sky turned colors that had no names in any language she knew. She wrote about needing someone who understood that solitude was not the same as peace, and that a quiet house could be the loudest kind of suffering. And at the bottom, in letters slightly larger than the rest, she had written, "Come, I'm waiting." So he came, because Silas Whitfield had spent his entire life belonging to no one and nowhere, and the promise of being waited for was more than he could resist. The conductor announced Cradle Creek as the train began to slow, and Silas gathered his valise with hands that had started trembling somewhere around the Virginia border and had not stopped since. Inside the case, stacked tight as bricks, were 14 books, a blank ledger, 2 changes of clothes, a shaving kit, his teaching certificate, and $47 in carefully folded bills. His entire life compressed into a box smaller than a hay bale. The station at Cradle Creek was barely a station at all. A wooden platform beside the tracks, a small building with a hand-painted sign, and beyond it a town that looked like someone had scattered buildings across a valley floor and never bothered to organize them into proper streets. Mountains rose on every side, enormous and indifferent, their peaks already dusted with the first suggestion of autumn snow. Silas stepped off the train, and the air hit him like a revelation. Clean in a way Philadelphia air never was, sharp with pine and cold water. And something else, something ancient that had nothing to do with human beings and everything to do with the earth itself. He stood on the platform, valise in hand, spectacles slightly fogged from the temperature change, and looked for the woman who had written him letters that made him believe in things he had stopped believing in years ago. He did not find one woman. He found 3. They stood beside a battered wagon 20 paces from the platform, and even from that distance, Silas could see they were unlike any women he had encountered in his carefully bounded Philadelphia existence. All 3 wore riding trousers and boots and wide-brimmed hats pulled low against the autumn sun. All 3 had the lean-muscled look of people who worked hard every day of their lives, tan skin and strong hands and postures that communicated absolute territorial authority. The tallest stood in the center with her arms crossed over her chest and her jaw set in a line that suggested she had already decided Silas was a mistake. She had deep green eyes, chestnut brown hair pulled back in a rough braid with strands escaping around a face that was handsome rather than pretty, all cheekbones and stubbornness. Late 20s, the one in charge. To her left stood a woman slightly shorter with storm-colored gray-blue eyes and dark honey-blonde hair, a long, pale scar running the length of her left forearm. She leaned against the wagon wheel with one hand resting on a horse's bridle, watching Silas with the patient, assessing gaze of someone who spent more time with animals than people. Mid-20s, the quiet one. To the right, the youngest, barely past 20, with auburn red hair catching fire in the sunlight, and amber hazel eyes bright with a complicated mixture of excitement and guilt. She was the one who stepped forward as Silas approached her, smile strained but genuine, her hands twisting the hem of her shirt. "You are Silas Whitfield?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." He removed his hat, a reflex of Eastern courtesy that felt absurd under the circumstances. "I have come to meet Miss B. Calloway. I am Bertie. These are my sisters, Hazel." She gestured to the tall one. "And Wren," the quiet one. "There is something I perhaps neglected to mention in my letters." "That there are 3 of you," Silas said. The words came out with a calm that surprised even him, because inside his chest, his heart had begun a slow, sickening descent toward his stomach. 3 women? Not one. 3 women who looked like they could wrestle mountain lions before breakfast, and here he stood in his wrinkled white shirt and dusty waistcoat, with his leather valise full of books and his spectacles sliding down his nose, looking like exactly what he was. A city boy who had wandered into the wrong story. Not neglected, Bertie said carefully. More like selectively presented. She lied. Hazel uncrossed her arms and took 2 steps forward, her green eyes sweeping over Silas from hat to boots, with the thoroughness of a buyer evaluating livestock she had already decided not to purchase. The arrangement is simple, Mr. Whitfield. We need a man's name on our land deed. You sign the papers live in the converted shed, eat 3 meals a day, and exist legally until the paperwork is settled. After that, you are free to leave or stay as you choose. Clear. Her voice carried the same cadence as the mountains around them. Hard, uncompromising, carved by forces that did not care about comfort. I sold everything I own, Silas said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The truth had its own volume. I resigned my teaching position. I traveled 3 days on trains that smelled of coal smoke and other people's anxiety. I brought everything I possess in this world inside this case. I did not come here to be a signature Miss Calloway. I came because that letter told me someone needed me. Not my name, me. Silence settled over the 4 of them, thick as the mountain air. Somewhere behind the station, a dog barked twice and fell quiet. A breeze moved through the pines on the hillside above them, carrying the scent of resin and distance. Bertie's face had turned the color of her hair. Wren tilted her head, had the first sign of interest she had shown studying Silas the way she might study an unfamiliar animal that had wandered into her territory. Dangerous or useful? The verdict was not yet in. Hazel's expression did not change, but something flickered behind her eyes. She turned to Bertie. How many days left? 73. Not enough time to find someone else. No. Hazel looked back at Silas, and he understood that he was being evaluated not on his merits, but on the absence of alternatives. It was not flattering, but it was honest, and Silas had learned long ago to prefer honest cruelty over kind deception. Fine, Hazel said. Get in the wagon. The ride to the Calloway Ranch took 2 hours through terrain that made Silas grateful he was sitting in the wagon bed rather than attempting to navigate it on horseback. The trail wound upward through forests of pine and oak, crossed 2 streams on bridges made of logs that seemed optimistic about their structural integrity, and climbed switchbacks so steep that Silas gripped the wagon sides with both hands and tried not to think about the drop-offs. Hazel rode ahead on a large bay horse, controlling the animal with her knees rather than her reins, her back straight as a soldier on patrol. Wren rode alongside the wagon on a paint mare, her gray-blue eyes constantly scanning the mountainside in a pattern Silas recognized as systematic surveillance, looking for threats, calculating escape routes. The habits of someone who lived in a world where danger was not theoretical. Bertie drove the wagon. She had stopped chattering, apparently realizing that nothing she said was going to improve the situation she had created. Instead, she handled the team with competent silence, negotiating the difficult terrain with the casual skill of someone who had been doing this since before she could read. Silas used the time to observe. He noticed how Hazel checked behind them every few minutes without turning her head, using peripheral vision, trained by years of awareness. He noticed the rifle in a scabbard on her saddle and the way her hand drifted toward it whenever the trail entered a section with poor visibility. He noticed the way Wren communicated with her horse through barely perceptible shifts in weight, a language of pressure and release that the animal understood as perfectly as spoken words. He noticed that Bertie's hands on the reins were steady, despite her obvious distress that her driving was smooth and precise, that she read the trail 3 turns ahead and prepared for obstacles before they appeared. These were not women who needed a man for anything practical. They needed one for a piece of paper. The injustice of it burned in Silas's chest, and he took out his small notebook and began writing observations. Dates, calculations, the beginnings of a record that might prove useful later. The ranch appeared as they crested the final ridge, and Silas drew a sharp breath. 400 acres of mountain land spread before him, meadows and forest, and 2 silver creeks catching afternoon light. At the center stood a cabin built of logs so massive they must have taken a team of men to raise 2 stories high, with a stone chimney and a covered porch that wrapped around three sides. Behind it, a barn, a stable, a root cellar, and several outbuildings arranged with the logic of a working operation designed by someone who understood efficiency. Papa built it, Bertie said quietly following his gaze. Took him 5 years, cut every log himself. Mama said he was building a fortress, not a house. He said the mountains required respect, and the only way to show it was to build something worthy of the view. Silas looked at the cabin and thought about the man who had raised 3 daughters alone in this wilderness, who had taught them to ride and shoot and survive, who had built this place with his own hands and defended it with his own will. A man now dead under circumstances that clearly troubled his oldest daughter, even though she had not spoken of it. They pulled into the yard and Silas climbed down from the wagon, his legs stiff from the long ride. 3 dogs appeared from somewhere barking with more curiosity than menace, and he let them sniff his hands before attempting to move further. Animals were honest judges of character. He had always gotten along well with animals. The shed is there? Hazel pointed to a small structure beside the barn that had clearly been hastily converted from storage to living quarters. A window had been cut into one wall, curtains hung with the precision of someone who did not normally hang curtains. There is a cot, a lantern, and a wash basin. Meals are in the main house at 6 noon and 6. Stay out of the way. Do not touch the horses without permission. Do not enter the house unless invited. Understood. And Mr. Whitfield. She paused at the door of the main cabin, her hand on the frame. Do not mistake this for hospitality. This is necessity. When necessity ends, so does your welcome. The door closed behind her, solid as a verdict. Silas stood in the yard holding his valise, surrounded by dogs and mountains, and the overwhelming awareness that he had traveled 3 days to reach a place where he was tolerated rather than wanted. It was, he reflected, not entirely unfamiliar. The orphanage had prepared him well for being somewhere without being welcome. He carried his valise into the shed and examined his new quarters. The cot was narrow but sturdy. Someone, likely Bertie, had left a folded quilt on top that was handmade and beautiful. The wash basin was clean. A small shelf had been mounted on one wall, and Silas immediately began unloading his books, lining them up with the spines facing out, creating a small library in the wilderness that made the space feel almost like somewhere he could live. The walls were rough-hewn timber, solid and well-fitted, but Silas noticed marks on the far wall that did not match the natural grain of the wood. He stepped closer and ran his fingers along them. Patches of filler carefully smoothed and painted over in a pattern that his analytical mind immediately recognized. Bullet holes. Someone had fired into this wall, and someone else had repaired the damage and tried to make it disappear. Silas said nothing to himself, but he filed the observation alongside every other detail that did not add up about this place and the circumstances that had brought him here. Under the cot, he found a pair of work gloves that were too large for his hands and a note in handwriting he did not recognize. Neither Bertie's elaborate script nor the sharp, practical hand he imagined Hazel would use. This was something in between. Spare gloves. The mornings are cold. No signature. Wren. He pulled the gloves on and flexed his fingers. They were too big, but they were warm and someone had thought to provide them. After a lifetime spent in institutions and rented rooms, the small kindness of spare gloves left in advance of his arrival was enough to make his eyes sting. The first morning began before dawn with a pounding on the shed door that Silas initially mistook for a dream about construction work. He stumbled to the door in his underclothes and found Hazel standing in the blue-gray pre-dawn light, already dressed for work, holding a piece of paper. Your tasks for the day, she said, handing it over without preamble. Split firewood, haul water from the lower creek, repair the fence line along the south meadow. The posts are rotting and need replacement. Silas looked at the list and then at Hazel's face, which wore the expression of someone conducting an experiment whose outcome she had already predicted. I have never split firewood, he said. Then today you learn. I have never repaired a fence. Then today you learn that too. Is there anything on this list that I actually know how to do? Hauling water requires walking and carrying. I assume Philadelphia teaches that. She turned and walked toward the barn. Silas watched her go, then looked down at the list again, then out at the mountains where the first light was just touching the highest peaks with gold. All right, he said to no one in particular. Today I learn. He learned that splitting firewood was an activity designed by nature to humiliate men with academic backgrounds. The axe was heavier than he expected, the wood was harder, and the coordination required to hit the same spot twice was apparently a skill that could not be acquired from books. By mid-morning, he had produced a small pile of irregularly shaped pieces that bore only passing resemblance to firewood. His hands were blistered and bleeding through the two large gloves, and his shoulders burned with the specific agony of muscles being asked to do things they had never been designed for. From the stable, Wren watched. She was working with a new horse, a wild-caught Mustang, with a coat like dark copper and eyes full of justified suspicion. Her method was patience incarnate. She stood in the corral, making herself small and still waiting for the horse to choose approach rather than forcing contact. It could take hours. She did not seem to mind. Between sessions with the Mustang, she observed Silas's battle with the firewood. She noticed that he never stopped. His technique was terrible, his output pathetic compared to what Hazel could produce in 20 minutes. But he did not complain, did not rest more than a moment to catch his breath, and did not ask for help. When his blisters broke and blood seeped through the gloves, he wrapped his hands in strips torn from an undershirt and kept swinging. The fence repair went worse. Silas had brought a book on basic carpentry that he consulted frequently, holding it open with one bleeding hand while trying to work a post hole digger with the other. The result was uneven holes, crooked posts, and a section of fence that leaned at an angle, suggesting it might collapse under the weight of a determined rabbit. By evening, Silas could barely lift his arms. He walked to the main house for dinner, moving like a man twice his age, every muscle announcing its betrayal. Hazel was already at the table serving stew with the efficiency of long practice. Wren sat at one end, quiet as always. Bertie occupied the other end, her face still carrying the guilt of a secret keeper whose secret had not gone as planned. Dinner was eaten in near silence. The stew was good, thick with venison and root vegetables, and Silas ate with the desperate enthusiasm of someone who had burned more energy in one day than in the previous month combined. When he reached for a second helping, Hazel looked at his hands, red and raw and wrapped in improvised bandages, and something crossed her face that was gone before he could identify it. After dinner, Bertie brought Silas his meal in the shed, an extra portion of stew and bread, clearly taken from her own serving. She set it on the small table and stood there wringing her hands. "I'm sorry," she said, "for the letters, for making you think it would be different, and I wrote what I wished was true instead of what was." Silas looked at her and saw a young woman drowning in the gap between what she had imagined and what existed. He knew that gap well. He had lived in it his entire life. "You write beautifully," he said. "Those letters were the most beautiful thing anyone has ever given me. The circumstances are different than I expected, yes, but I am not sorry I came. You are not angry. I am exhausted and my hands feel like they have been set on fire, but no, I am not angry." Relief washed over her face, followed immediately by another wave of guilt. "Hazel is testing you. She wants you to quit and leave." "I know. Are you going to?" Silas looked down at his hands and out the small window where the mountain peaks were black against a sky thick with stars. More stars than he had ever seen. More sky than he had known existed. More silence than any city boy could possibly be prepared for. "No," he said, "I am not going to quit." On the third day, Silas discovered something that changed the trajectory of everything. He was reorganizing the shed, trying to make the small space more livable, when he noticed a section of floor that sounded different when he walked on it. Hollow. He knelt and found the boards were loose, concealing a space beneath barely large enough to hold the metal box he pulled from the darkness. Inside was a leather-bound journal, well used, the handwriting strong and angular. Tobias Calloway's handwriting, he guessed, based on the dates spanning several years. Silas opened it with careful hands, aware that he was reading a dead man's private thoughts without permission, but unable to stop himself from looking. Most entries detailed ranch business, cattle counts, breeding records, supply orders. But the final pages were different. The handwriting grew urgent, the entries shorter, the tone shifting from practical to frightened. "Found copper deposits along the North Creek. Significant vein, Greer knows. He has been surveying my land without permission. Caught his men on the North Ridge twice this month. And later, Greer offered to buy the North 40. I refused. He did not take refusal well. Told me I would regret it. I do not regret it. This land belongs to my girls." The final entry, dated 2 weeks before Tobias Calloway's reported death by horsefall, made Silas's blood run cold. "Must hide the survey maps. If something happens to me, the girls need protection. I have written to the Women's Settlement Society about finding a husband for the girls. Someone educated, Someone who can fight with paper and ink instead of fists and bullets. A teacher, maybe. Someone Greer would underestimate. Trust the outsider. Trust the man who comes with books instead of guns. Silas read the entry 3 times. Tobias had planned for this, had planned for someone exactly like Silas, had understood that the threat to his daughters was not the kind that could be defeated with rifles and frontier toughness alone, but required the particular weapons of literacy, legal knowledge, and the capacity to navigate systems that men like Greer used as instruments of theft. He had not lived to see his plan through. Bertie, perhaps finding the correspondence after his death, had continued what her father started, answering the advertisement, writing to Silas, bringing him here. Whether she knew about the journal, about her father's specific intentions, Silas could not tell. He closed the journal carefully, replaced it in the metal box, and sat on his cot, thinking about a dead man who had somehow chosen him from beyond the grave. The weight of that trust settled on his shoulders, heavier than any axe or fence post. Also on the third day, Emmett Greer came to the ranch. Silas heard the horse's first hoofbeats on the trail, approaching fast, with the careless speed of men who considered other people's territory an extension of their own. He stepped out of the shed to find 3 riders pulling into the yard. 2 were rough-looking men with the blank faces of hired muscle. The third was different. Emmett Greer was 30 years old and carried himself with the aggressive confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone whose opinion he respected. Handsome in a hard way, with his father's calculating eyes set in a younger, crueler face. He wore expensive riding clothes and a gun belt that suggested the weapon was not decorative. Hazel emerged from the cabin with a rifle in her hands, held low but ready. Wren appeared from the stable, similarly armed. Bertie stepped onto the porch with a shotgun that looked nearly as big as she was. 3 mountain women with weapons arranged in a defensive formation that spoke of practice. They had done this before. "Morning, Hazel." Emmett smiled the way certain men smile at women they believe they own. "Heard you got yourself a mail-order husband. Thought I would come welcome him to the neighborhood." His eyes found Silas standing by the shed in his wrinkled shirt and spectacles, hands wrapped in bandages, looking like precisely what he was. A city-bred school teacher who had wandered into a world that could eat him alive without pausing to chew. Emmett laughed. It was the laugh of a man who had just been given a gift. "This is him. You ordered a person or a scarecrow?" Hazel's jaw tightened, but she did not respond. Her finger stayed near the trigger guard. Silas walked forward, not fast, not slow, the deliberate pace of a man who understood that this moment was being carefully observed and that his response would define how he was perceived for a very long time. "Silas Whitfield," he said, "Philadelphia. Very pleased to meet you." He extended his hand. Emmett looked at the offered hand as if it were something unpleasant on the bottom of his boot. He did not take it. 73 days, Emmett said to Hazel, ignoring Silas entirely. "That is what you have left." His smile widened. "Enjoy them." The 3 riders wheeled their horses and rode out the way they came, fast and careless, and leaving dust hanging in the air like a threat. After they disappeared around the ridge, Hazel lowered her rifle. Her hands were steady. Her voice was not. "You see now, that is what we face. Not firewood and fence posts. That you think you can handle that Mr. Whitfield." "What does he want?" Silas asked. "Our land." "Why, Pong?" The question stopped her. She opened her mouth, then closed it, then looked at him with an expression he had not seen before. Not contempt or dismissal, but something closer to grudging reconsideration. "I do not know exactly why," she admitted. "Papa always said Greer wanted to expand, but 400 acres of mountain ranch is not worth the trouble he is going through." Silas thought about the journal, about copper deposits along the North Creek, about survey maps hidden somewhere on this property, about a dead man's final warning. He was not ready to share what he had found. Not yet. Trust had to be earned before secrets could be exchanged, and he had been here only 3 days. But the knowledge changed everything. It gave the threat a shape he could understand, a motivation that followed the logic of greed rather than simple malice. "May I see your financial records?" he asked. "Why?" "Because I am a trained accountant, and when someone wants something, you have the first place to look for their methods is in the money." Hazel studied him for a long moment. The mountain wind moved through the yard, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow. Behind her, Wren and Bertie waited, still holding their weapons, watching this exchange with the attention of people whose futures depended on its outcome. "Bertie keeps the books," Hazel said finally. Such as they are. The books were a disaster of good intentions and poor methodology. Bertie was intelligent and literate, but had never been taught proper bookkeeping, and the result was a jumble of figures that required 3 hours of careful work to untangle. When Silas finished, the picture that emerged made his jaw tighten. "You are being cheated," he said flatly. "Jacob Pruitt has been buying your cattle at 40% below market value for at least 2 years. The numbers are right here, Chumum." He pointed to columns he had reorganized and annotated. "Fair market price for your stock should be roughly double what you have been receiving." "That is impossible," Hazel said, leaning over his shoulder to examine the figures. "Pruitt said prices were down across the territory." "Prices are not down. I checked the territorial livestock reports before I left Philadelphia. Your cattle are prime quality. Pruitt is stealing from you in broad daylight and calling it commerce." "And Pruitt is Greer's man," Hazel said slowly, understanding, settling across her face like shadow across a valley. "Yes." Silas pulled a blank sheet of paper from his ledger and began writing. "I am composing a formal complaint to the Regional Cattlemen's Association, documenting the price discrepancies with supporting evidence. They have oversight authority over member dealers, which Pruitt is. If the complaint is substantiated, Pruitt faces sanctions and potentially restitution." Hazel watched him write, his hand moving with the fluid precision of someone who had spent his life with pen and paper, each letter clean and purposeful, each sentence constructed with the structural integrity of a legal brief. "You write better than any lawyer I have ever met," she said, and the surprise in her voice was its own kind of compliment. "I am not a lawyer, I am a teacher, but mathematics does not know how to lie." That night, Wren came to the shed. Silas was reading by candlelight, his battered copy of Marcus Aurelius open on his lap, when a quiet knock interrupted the silence. He opened the door to find the middle Calloway sister standing in the moonlight, her face silver in shadow, the scar on her forearm pale as a river on a map. "May I come in?" Her voice was lower than her sister's, rougher, as if she used it less frequently and had not bothered to sand down the edges. "Of course." She entered and looked around the small space. Her eyes lingered on the books lined up on the shelf, on the careful way he had arranged his few possessions, on the journal she could not see hidden beneath the floorboards. "Are you frightened?" she asked. "Being here, in the mountains, with 3 women you do not know and men who want to drive you away?" "Yes," Silas said, "very. But you are staying." "I have been alone for 27 years, Wren. Fear is not new to me. What is new is having a reason to stay somewhere, despite the fear." She was quiet for a time, leaning against the doorframe, her gray-blue eyes watching him with the same patient assessment she gave her horses. "The Mustang I am training," she said finally. "He is afraid of everything. Every sound, every shadow, every person who comes near. But he has stopped running because he has learned that I will not hurt him." She paused. "You remind me of that horse." Then she was gone, slipping back into the darkness with the soundless grace of someone born to the mountains, leaving Silas alone with the strangest and gentlest observation anyone had ever made about him. He picked up his pen and wrote in his own journal, Day 3. "I have been compared to a frightened horse by a woman who speaks to animals better than people. I believe it was a compliment. I believe it was the most honest thing anyone has said to me in 27 years. The trip to Cradle Creek for the marriage registration came at the end of the first week, and it was during this trip that Silas learned exactly how deep the opposition ran. All 4 of them went. Hazel rode ahead as always. Wren flanked the wagon. Bertie drove while Silas sat beside her wearing his best suit, which was his only suit, brushed clean and pressed flat with a heated pan because he did not own an iron. Cradle Creek revealed itself as a town of perhaps 200 souls built along a single main street, with a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a boarding house that doubled as the post office, and at the far end the courthouse where Judge Harlan Greer dispensed justice according to his personal definition of the word. The town's reaction to Silas was immediate and universal. Men stopped what they were doing to stare. Women whispered behind their hands. Children pointed. He was clearly not from here. His clothes were wrong, his build was wrong, his spectacles and ink-stained fingers, in complete absence of weapons, marked him as foreign, as if he had arrived from another planet rather than another state. 3 mountain girls ordered themselves a husband, someone said loud enough to carry, and this is what they got. Laughter followed. Silas kept walking. At the post office and boarding house, A woman named Maggie Boone provided the first kindness he had received from anyone in Cradle Creek outside the Calloway sisters. She was 55, compact and sharp-eyed, with a voice that could strip paint at 20 paces, and a heart apparently made of material softer than her exterior suggested. "Ignore them, young man," she said, pressing a cup of coffee into his hands. "Mouths are the cheapest thing on the frontier. Everybody has one and nobody keeps it shut." At the courthouse, Judge Harlan Greer examined Silas's papers with the contemptuous thoroughness of a man who hoped to find a disqualifying flaw and was disappointed when he could not. The judge was 60, heavy-set with eyes that calculated profit the way other men's eyes calculated distance. He looked at Silas the way Emmett had, like something amusing, like something temporary. "You are a school teacher," Greer said, "from Philadelphia." "Yes, Your Honor." "These girls need a man, Mr. Whitfield, not a bookworm." He chuckled at his own wit. "The law requires a legal spouse for property rights transfer," Silas replied evenly. "I believe I meet the legal requirements." Greer's smile thinned. "The marriage must be verified by the local minister and 2 resident witnesses. Additionally, I will send an inspector to confirm the marriage is genuine within the 90-day period. If this is merely a paper arrangement," he let the implication hang. On the ride home, Hazel broke the silence. "You heard him. It is not enough to sign papers. Greer will send someone to check. They need to see us living as husband and wife." "Which means," Silas said carefully, "someone needs to actually marry me, not just on paper." The 3 sisters looked at each other in a communication that required no words, conducted entirely through glances and subtle shifts in expression. Years of living together in isolation had given them a private language that Silas could observe but not yet decipher. "Who?" Bertie began. "Me." Hazel cut her off. "I am the eldest. I am the one on the deed, and I am the one who can keep this purely practical." She turned to Silas, her green eyes flat as stone. "Do not misunderstand this, Mr. Whitfield. This is a contract. Nothing more and nothing less." "Understood," Silas said. But in his chest, in the place where the letters from Miss B. Calloway had cracked open something he had spent his whole life sealing shut. He felt the first dangerous stirring of something that had nothing to do with contracts, and everything to do with the way Hazel Calloway's hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. The way her voice broke on the word practical. The way she fought so hard against needing anyone that the fighting itself revealed how desperately she needed someone to be worth trusting. That night, unable to sleep, Silas retrieved the journal from beneath the floor and read the final entry one more time by candlelight. "Trust the outsider. Trust the man who comes with books instead of guns." "I will try," he whispered to a dead man who had somehow chosen him. "I will try to be worth trusting." Outside, the mountain wind moved through the pines, carrying the sound of distance and darkness, and the first cold breath of a winter that would test everything. Above the ridgeline, stars burned in numbers too vast to count, indifferent to the small human drama unfolding beneath them. And in the main cabin behind walls of log that a determined man had built with his own hands to protect the daughters he loved more than his own life, 3 mountain women lay in their beds and contemplated the impossible situation they had created. An Eastern school teacher with bleeding hands and a valise full of books. Their father's last desperate hope. A man who did not belong here by any reasonable measure, but who had somehow in 3 short days begun to make himself necessary in ways none of them had anticipated and none of them were prepared to admit. 70 days remained. 70 days to save their land, their home, their father's legacy. 70 days with a gentleman who had never split firewood or ridden a horse or faced down armed men, but who carried weapons of his own. Weapons made of ink and numbers, and a quiet, unbreakable determination that came from having nothing to lose and suddenly finding everything worth fighting for. Tomorrow they would face whatever came next. Together. The wedding took place on a Tuesday morning in the small white church at the end of Cradle Creek's only proper street, and it was the quietest ceremony Reverend Thomas had performed in 30 years of frontier ministry. Hazel wore her mother's dress. It was 20 years old cotton with lace at the collar that had yellowed with time, but the stitching held and the fabric fell in clean lines around her tall frame. Bertie had pressed it with a heated flat iron until it looked almost new, and Wren had gathered wild asters from the meadow to weave into a small bouquet because somebody insisted there had to be flowers. Silas wore his only suit, which he had beaten clean against a fence post, impressed with the same flat iron Bertie had used on the dress. His spectacles were polished. His shoes were brushed. His hands, still wrapped in strips of cotton, where the blisters had not yet healed, trembled slightly as he stood at the altar and waited for the woman who was marrying him out of legal necessity rather than any sentiment resembling affection. Hazel walked down the short aisle with Bertie and Wren flanking her, and the image struck Silas with unexpected force. Three women moving together with the coordinated grace of a unit that had operated as one, for years the tallest in the center, the youngest on the right practically vibrating with suppressed emotion, the quietest on the left calm as deep water. They were not giving Hazel away. They were presenting her, and the distinction mattered. Maggie Boone sat in the front pew as the second community witness, her sharp eyes suspiciously bright. The rest of the church was empty. Hazel had refused to make a public event of what she considered a bureaucratic procedure. Reverend Thomas, an elderly man with kind eyes and a stammer that worsened under stress, conducted the service with admirable brevity. He asked the necessary questions. Hazel answered in a voice flat as a ledger entry, her green eyes fixed on a point somewhere above Silas's left shoulder, refusing to meet his gaze. Silas answered with a voice that broke once on the word cherish and then steadied itself through sheer force of will. When the Reverend Prince Zahir announced them husband and wife, there was a moment when tradition demanded a kiss. Hazel turned towards Silas with the expression of someone about to swallow medicine. Silas leaned forward and pressed his lips to her cheek, barely touching, a gesture so restrained it was almost not a kiss at all. But he felt the heat of her skin beneath his mouth, felt the slight tremor that ran through her, and understood that her composure was costing her more than she would ever admit. They signed the certificate. Bertie signed as witness. Maggie signed as second witness, pressing the pen down with such force that the nib nearly tore through the paper. Done. Legal. Binding. Outside the church, autumn wind scattered leaves across the churchyard, and Emmett Greer leaned against a hitching post across the street, watching them emerge. He did not approach. He did not speak. He simply watched with the patient malice of someone keeping score, and his smile was the smile of a man who believed the game was already won. Silas looked at him. Emmett looked back. Between them passed an understanding that required no words. This was not over. This was barely beginning. The ride home was silent except for the creak of wagon wheels and the rhythmic fall of hooves on packed earth. Hazel sat beside Silas on the wagon bench, this time Bertie having surrendered the reins, with an expression that suggested she was reading romantic significance into an arrangement that was purely practical. The new bride and groom sat 12 inches apart, neither touching both, staring straight ahead at the trail unwinding before them like a future neither had chosen but both were committed to navigating. At the ranch, the arrangement was made explicit. Silas would continue sleeping in the shed. Hazel would remain in the main cabin. The marriage existed on paper and nowhere else. These were the terms. These were the boundaries. Hazel stated them with the precision of someone drawing lines on a map, and Silas accepted them with the quiet compliance of a man who understood that pushing against walls only made them stronger. The first month of marriage was a study in proximity without intimacy, in shared purpose without shared warmth. Silas threw himself into the work of making himself useful in ways that did not require the physical strength he did not possess. He rebuilt the ranch's financial records from the ground up. Every transaction Bertie had scrawled in her chaotic ledger was transferred into Silas's clean, methodical system of columns and figures. Income, expenses, projections. For the first time in years, the Calloway sisters could see exactly where they stood financially, and the picture was worse than any of them had imagined. They were not just being cheated by Pruitt. They were slowly being strangled. Between the artificially depressed cattle prices, increased costs for supplies from the Cradle Creek General Store, which was owned by a man who owed favors to Judge Greer, and mysterious losses of livestock that coincided suspiciously with Emmett's visits to the area, the ranch was bleeding money at a rate that would make it unsustainable within 2 years. This is not bad luck, Silas told the three sisters. One evening, his ledger spread across the kitchen table, columns of numbers telling a story of deliberate economic warfare. This is a strategy. Someone is methodically destroying your ability to sustain this ranch so that when the time comes to force a sale, you will have no choice but to accept whatever price is offered. Hazel stared at the numbers as if they were enemies she could intimidate into retreating. How do we fight it? We document everything. We establish fair market values through independent sources. We find alternative buyers for your cattle who are not connected to Greer. And we send a formal complaint to the Territorial Cattlemen's Association with enough evidence to trigger an investigation. You can do all that? I can write the letters, compile the evidence, and present the case. What I cannot do is make powerful people care about justice for 3 women on a mountain ranch. That requires leverage we do not yet have. He began writing letters that night. Careful, precise documents addressed to the Cattlemen's Association, to the Territorial Governor's Office, to 3 regional newspapers whose editors had reputations for taking on corruption stories. Each letter was a small weapon, crafted with the same meticulous attention to detail that Silas brought to everything he did. Facts arranged in devastating order. Numbers that told their own damning story. Language that was measured and reasonable but carried beneath its surface the controlled fury of a man who had discovered that the people he was beginning to care about were being systematically destroyed. Bertie found new purpose in helping him. She had her father's intelligence and her own natural gift for language, and Silas channeled both into teaching her proper bookkeeping, legal correspondence, and the art of constructing an argument that could survive scrutiny. She absorbed knowledge with the hunger of someone who had been starving for intellectual engagement, and within weeks she was drafting letters that required only minor corrections before sending. "You should be writing more than business correspondence," Silas told her one evening after reviewing a particularly well-crafted complaint letter. "You have a talent for putting words together that is wasted on cattle price disputes." Bertie looked at him with something that was not quite surprise, but closer to the shock of being seen. "Papa used to say the same thing. He said I should write down our family's story before it was lost." "Then write it. The letters can wait an hour each evening. Use that hour for your own words." She began writing that night, not letters, stories. The history of the Calloway family, told through the eyes of the youngest daughter, full of detail and emotion, and a raw honesty that made Silas's chest ache when she showed him the first pages. With Wren, the connection grew through a different language entirely. She continued teaching Silas to ride, and these lessons became the framework for a relationship built on patience and nonverbal communication. Wren spoke more to her horses in a single morning than she spoke to other humans in a week, and Silas learned to exist in her silences without trying to fill them. He was a terrible rider at first. His body fought the horse's rhythm instead of surrendering to it. His hands gripped the reins too tightly, and his legs clenched the saddle with the desperate intensities of someone convinced that gravity was a personal enemy. But Wren was relentless in her quiet way, correcting his position with touches rather than words, placing his hands where they needed to be, pressing his knee into the proper angle. "Stop thinking," she said during his third lesson, the most words she had strung together in his presence. "Your brain is fighting your body. Let the horse teach you. She knows what she is doing, even if you do not." It was, Silas reflected, excellent advice for more than just riding. Gradually, his body learned what his mind could not teach it. He stopped fighting the mare's rhythm and began moving with it, his spine loosening, his hands softening on the reins. Wren watched the transformation with the satisfaction of someone whose faith in process had been confirmed. "You are not a natural horseman," she told him after a week, which was the most she had ever said about his abilities. "But you listen. Most men do not listen to horses. They try to dominate them. You try to understand them. That is better." One afternoon, while Silas rested on a fence rail after a particularly grueling lesson, Wren sat beside him and spoke about something other than horses for the first time. "Hazel is the strong one," she said, staring at the mountains. "Bertie is the bright one. I have always been the one in between, not the leader, not the light, just the one who keeps the animals alive and stays quiet while my sisters fill the room." Silas considered this carefully. "You are the foundation," he said. "Hazel leads because she is standing on ground you keep solid. Bertie shines because you give her a safe place to shine from. Without you, everything they are collapses. They may not realize it, but I do. You are not in between anything, Wren. You are underneath everything, holding it all up." She looked at him with her gray blue eyes, and he watched something shift behind them. Not dramatically, not with the sudden revelation of a person whose life has changed in an instant, but with the slow, tectonic movement of someone who has been told a truth they needed to hear and is allowing it to find its proper place inside them. "Nobody has ever said that to me," she said quietly. "Then nobody has been paying attention." Hazel was the last to yield, and her resistance was the most formidable because it was built not on dislike, but on fear. She had watched her mother love her father with a devotion that had nearly destroyed her during the years when Tobias Calloway was a harder man before the mountains softened him, before his daughters taught him tenderness. She had learned from her mother's example that needing someone was the most dangerous thing a woman could do because need gave another person the power to break you. So she kept Silas at arm's length. She acknowledged his usefulness without acknowledging him. She accepted his contributions to the ranch's survival without accepting that his presence was anything more than a temporary solution to a legal problem. She was polite in the way that fortress walls are polite, presenting a smooth surface that revealed nothing of what lay behind them. But the walls had cracks, and Silas could see them widening. She cracked when Silas organized the winter supply inventory and calculated exactly what they needed to survive the coming months, saving them $200 in unnecessary purchases through careful planning. She cracked when he sat up all night with a sick calf that Hazel had hand-raised from birth, feeding it warm milk through a cloth rag and singing badly to keep it calm, because he had read somewhere that animals responded to human voices and he had no other medicine to offer. She cracked when Emmett Greer's men cut the fence along the south meadow in the middle of the night, and 15 cattle wandered into the forest, and Silas was the first person awake to discover the damage, and the first person out in the pre-dawn darkness, following tracks with a lantern, while the sisters saddled horses. They lost 2 head, found the others scattered across 3 miles of mountain terrain. 3 days of hard riding to recover them all, and Silas, despite being barely competent in the saddle, rode every mile without complaint. His legs were so sore by the end that Wren had to help him dismount, and he walked like a man made of wood for a week afterward. But he had been there. He had not hidden in his shed while the women did the hard work. He had shown up. The poisoning came 2 weeks later. Someone, and they all knew, who had dumped rotting animal carcasses into the North Creek upstream from where the livestock drank. Within days, half the cattle were sick. The horses fared better because Wren had already moved them to the south pasture on instinct, but 2 of her favorites, a matched pair of roans she had raised from foals, drank from a contaminated puddle before she could stop them. They died within hours of each other, convulsing in the stable, while Wren knelt between them, her hands on their necks, her face completely still in the way that only people experienced with grief can manage. No tears, no sound, just the absolute silence of someone watching something they loved and knowing they were powerless to prevent it. Silas found her there after the horses had gone quiet. He did not speak, did not offer comfort or platitudes, or any of the useless words people deploy when confronted with another person's pain. He simply sat down on the stable floor beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and stayed. They sat like that for an hour, maybe more. The stable around them settled into the particular silence that follows death, heavy and hollow at the same time. Eventually, Wren's hand found his, and she held it with a grip that said everything her voice could not. "Thank you for being here. Thank you for not trying to fix something that cannot be fixed. Thank you for understanding that sometimes the only thing a person needs is someone willing to sit in the darkness with them." The fire came on a moonless night 3 weeks into the marriage. Silas woke to the smell of smoke and the orange glow of flames reflected on the ceiling of his shed. He was outside in seconds, barefoot, wearing only his sleeping clothes, and what he saw stopped his breath. The main storage barn was burning. Flames had already consumed the north wall and were climbing toward the roof where 6 months of winter feed was stored. Hay bales and grain sacks and dried provisions that represented the difference between surviving the winter and starving. He ran to the main cabin, pounding on the door, shouting for Hazel and her sisters. They emerged, already moving, Hazel barking orders with the precision of a military commander. Wren sprinted to the stable to move the horses. Bertie ran for the well. Silas grabbed buckets. They fought the fire for 4 hours. 4 hours of hauling water in a bucket chain that was desperately inadequate against the scale of the blaze. 4 hours of smoke so thick it turned breathing into an act of violence against your own lungs. 4 hours of heat so intense it blistered skin from 20 feet away. Silas burned his hands, pulling equipment from the barn before the roof collapsed. Not badly, but enough that the already damaged skin of his blistered palms split open again, and the pain was extraordinary. He wrapped them in wet cloth and kept hauling water because stopping was not an option. By dawn, the barn was a smoking ruin. They stood in the gray light, 4 people covered in soot and exhaustion staring at the destruction. 6 months of winter supplies. Gone. Hazel's composure, the fortress she had maintained through every previous assault, finally broke. Not dramatically. Not with screaming or crying or any of the large gestures that people expect from grief. She simply sat down in the dirt of the yard, pulled her knees to her chest, and put her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook. No sound came out. But the shaking said everything. Bertie went to her immediately, wrapping her arms around her oldest sister, crying openly the tears Hazel could not shed. Wren stood apart, her face carved from the same granite as the mountains, but her gray-blue eyes were bright with moisture that she would not let fall. Silas looked at the 3 of them and felt something crystallize inside his chest. Not anger, though anger was there. Not grief, though grief was there too. Something harder and more permanent than either. Purpose, the cold, clear purpose of a man who has identified his enemy and is no longer content to merely defend. He went into his shed, retrieved his writing materials, and began to work. Over the next 3 days, while the sisters scrambled to salvage what they could from the fire's aftermath, and began the desperate process of finding alternative winter supplies, Silas wrote. He composed a formal complaint to the territorial governor, 12 pages of detailed documentation, covering every incident of harassment, property damage, and economic manipulation the Callaway Ranch had suffered since Tobias's death. He included Pruitt's price manipulation data timeline analysis showing the escalating pattern of attacks and financial calculations demonstrating the systematic economic destruction of a legitimate homestead. He wrote separate letters to 3 newspaper editors, each tailored to the particular interests and readership of the publication. For the Richmond paper, he emphasized the legal corruption angle. For the Mountain Region Weekly, he focused on the threat to all small ranchers from unchecked judicial power. For the territorial capital paper, he highlighted the governance failure that allowed a sitting judge to use his office for personal land acquisition. He visited Doc Phineas, the elderly physician in Cradle Creek, who had treated Tobias Callaway after his death. The old doctor was 65, alcoholic, and haunted by a secret he had carried for months. Tobias did not fall from his horse. Phineas said, his hands shaking as he poured whiskey into a glass that was already dirty. I examined the body. The wound on his skull was wrong for a fall, wrong angle, wrong depth, consistent with a blow from behind by a heavy object. A rock maybe, or the butt of a rifle. You did not report this? To whom Greer is the judge. Greer is the law. What was I supposed to do? File a murder report with the man I suspected of ordering the murder? Would you sign a sworn statement to that effect? Phineas looked at Silas with the red-rimmed eyes of a man who had been waiting for someone to ask that question. If it would do any good, if someone could actually use it. I can use it. Silas left with the signed statement in his coat pocket, feeling the weight of it like a loaded weapon. He now had evidence of financial fraud, property destruction, and suspected murder. Against a judge who controlled the local courts, it was like holding a match near a powder keg. The explosion would be enormous, but the question was whether he could direct the blast at his enemies without catching his own people in the destruction. He presented his findings to the 3 sisters that evening in the kitchen of the main cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth lamplight, casting their faces in golden shadow. We have enough evidence to destroy Greer, he said, laying the documents on the table. Financial fraud through Pruitt, property destruction through Emmett, and this. He placed Phineas's sworn statement on top. Medical evidence that your father was murdered. The silence that followed was absolute. Hazel picked up the statement and read it, her hands steady, but her face draining of color. Bertie pressed her fingers to her mouth. Wren stood absolutely still, her gray-blue eyes burning. I knew, Hazel whispered. I knew it was not a fall. I saw the wound. I told the sheriff, and he said I was grieving and imagining things. Her voice hardened. He said I was a hysterical woman. He is Greer's man, Silas said. The sheriff, the general store owner, Pruitt, half the town. Greer has built a network of dependent people who owe him favors and fear his power. Our evidence means nothing if it goes through local channels. Then where does it go? The territorial governor, the newspapers, and if necessary, the federal marshals. We go over Greer's head. We make this too public and too well documented for anyone to ignore. Hazel looked at the stack of papers, then at Silas, and he watched the recalculation happening behind her eyes. This was not a man who could split firewood or repair fences or ride a horse without looking like he was negotiating a truce with gravity. But this was a man who could dissect a corrupt judge's operation with the same precision a surgeon used on a body who could transform scattered facts into a weapon that no amount of frontier toughness could match. "Do it," she said. "Send everything." The letters went out the next morning, carried by Maggie Boone's mail service with a personal guarantee from Maggie herself that they would reach their destinations intact. "About time someone put Harlan Greer's business in writing," Maggie said, tucking the envelopes into her leather satchel. "That man has been stealing from honest people in this valley since before you were born, young man. But nobody had the education or the courage to prove it." "I have the education," Silas said. "The courage belongs to the women who have been fighting him alone for years." Maggie looked at him with an expression that combined approval and something gentler. "You are not what I expected when I heard they had ordered a male husband from back east." "I am not what anyone expected. I am beginning to think that might be an advantage." The weeks following the fire were the hardest the ranch had endured. Without the stored winter supplies, survival depended on a scramble of emergency measures. Silas negotiated credit with suppliers outside Greer's network, writing to merchants in 3 neighboring towns, and leveraging the Cattlemen's Association complaint to demonstrate that the Callaway Ranch was a legitimate operation being unfairly targeted. Hazel and Wren worked from before dawn until after dark, moving cattle to better pasture, reinforcing fences, repairing the damaged corral. Bertie split her time between helping with physical labor and maintaining the correspondence campaign Silas had initiated. The 4 of them worked together with the desperate efficiency of people who understood that failure meant losing everything. And somewhere in the crucible of shared crisis, the boundaries Hazel had so carefully constructed began to dissolve. It happened in small moments. The morning Silas brought her coffee before she asked for it, having learned her routine well enough to anticipate her needs. The evening, she found him asleep at the kitchen table surrounded by letters and ledger pages, having worked until exhaustion defeated him, and she draped a blanket over his shoulders without waking him. The afternoon, they argued about fence placement, and she realized halfway through that she was not arguing with a subordinate, but with an equal someone whose opinion she valued even when she disagreed with it. The night of the storm changed everything. Rain came in sideways, driven by wind that screamed through the valley like something alive and furious. The temporary repairs on the barn roof tore loose, and the remaining stored supplies were at risk of water damage. All 4 of them ran out into the tempest, and for 2 hours they fought to secure tarps over the exposed sections, while rain hammered their bodies and wind tried to tear the materials from their hands. Hazel climbed to the roof because she always climbed to the roof because she was the eldest and the strongest and the one who put herself between her sisters and every danger. She was securing the final tarp when a gust caught it like a sail and nearly pulled her over the edge. Silas saw it happen from below, saw her feet slip, saw her body pitch sideways, saw her hands grab at nothing as the wind tried to claim her. He moved without thinking, without calculating, without any of the careful analytical consideration that characterized everything he did. Pure instinct drove him up the ladder and across the slick roof to where Hazel hung half over the edge, her fingers dug into the tarp, her boots scrabbling for purchase on wet wood. He was not strong enough to pull her up. That was a physical fact. He weighed 40 pounds less than Hazel and had none of her upper body strength. But he was strong enough to grab her belt and hold on, bracing his feet against a roof beam and leaning back with everything he had, creating just enough resistance to keep her from sliding further, while his free hand waved desperately at Wren below. Wren was up the ladder in seconds, her strong hands closing around Hazel's arm and hauling her back onto the roof with the decisive strength of someone who spent her days wrestling horses into submission. Together they pulled Hazel to safety, and the 3 of them sat on the rain-lashed roof in a huddle, gasping and trembling while the storm raged around them. Later, back in the cabin, soaked and shivering, wrapped in blankets by the fire while Bertie heated water for washing, Hazel said the word that changed the architecture of everything between them. "Thank you." 2 words, spoken quietly, directed at Silas, stripped of every defensive mechanism Hazel normally employed. Just gratitude raw and unadorned. "You are welcome," Silas said. "You could have fallen." "You were falling. That is not a reason to risk your own life." "Yes, it is." Hazel looked at him across the firelight, water still dripping from her hair, and Silas watched her see him. Not the scrawny school teacher from Philadelphia. Not the mail-order husband who could not split firewood. Not the temporary solution to a legal problem. Him. The man who ran toward danger when every rational calculation said to run away. The man who held on when he was not strong enough to pull. Something passed between them that was not a word or a touch, but was real enough to change the temperature of the room. Bertie noticed. Wren noticed. Nobody said anything. Some things were too fragile for language. The confrontation with Emmett Greer came on a cold morning 6 weeks into the marriage, when the first frost had silvered the meadow grass and the mountains wore their winter faces. 5 riders came up the trail at a pace that announced hostile intent, and by the time they reached the yard, Hazel, Wren, and Bertie were already positioned on the porch with their rifles. Emmett dismounted with the casual confidence of a man who believed violence was a conversation he always won. His 4 men stayed mounted, hands near weapons' eyes, scanning the property with the professional assessment of people accustomed to intimidation. "Time is running out, Hazel," Emmett said, planting himself in the center of the yard like a man claiming territory. "My father's patience is running out. This little game with your paper husband is not going to save you." "We are not playing games, Emmett." "No." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You think a skinny school teacher with eyeglasses and ink on his fingers is going to protect this ranch? He cannot even sit a horse properly. My father will invalidate that joke of a marriage, seize this land for back taxes, and you 3 will be out on the road with nothing. Unless," his smile widened, "unless you accept a better offer. There is no offer that involves you that I would accept. Think carefully, Hazel. I offered you marriage once, legitimately. You refused. That was your mistake. But I am a forgiving man. Marry me, transfer the deed, and your sisters can stay on as hired help. It is more generous than you deserve." The silence after this proposition was the kind that precedes either violence or transformation. Hazel's knuckles were white on her rifle. Wren had shifted her weight to her forward foot, a subtle repositioning that Silas had learned meant she was preparing to move quickly. Bertie's face had gone pale, her shotgun trembling in her grip. Silas stepped through the cabin door and onto the porch. He carried no weapon. In his hands was a leather portfolio stuffed with papers held before him like a shield made of truth instead of steel. He walked past the 3 armed women, down the porch steps and across the yard until he stood 10 feet from Emmett Greer, close enough to see the flicker of amusement in the man's eyes. "Mr. Greer," Silas said, and his voice carried a quality that none of them had heard before. Not loud, not aggressive, but carrying the absolute authority of a man who has done his homework and knows exactly how much destruction he holds in his hands. "I have copies of a formal complaint filed with the territorial governor documenting systematic fraud by Jacob Pruitt in collusion with your father's office. Price manipulation affecting not just this ranch, but every small rancher in the region." Emmett's smile thinned. "I have copies of a property damage timeline linking the destruction of this ranch's assets to periods immediately following your visits to the area. Fence cuttings, water poisoning, arson, each incident documented with dates, evidence, and witness statements." The smile disappeared entirely. "And I have a sworn medical statement from Dr. Phineas confirming that Tobias Calloway's death was not consistent with a horsefall, that the wound pattern suggests homicide. This statement has been filed with the territorial governor, the federal marshal's office in Richmond, and 3 newspapers." Emmett's face had gone from amused to white. His hands clenched at his sides, and Silas could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid reassessment of a situation that had suddenly shifted from certain victory to potential catastrophe. "You are threatening me," Emmett's voice had dropped to something low and dangerous. "No, I'm informing you. There is a difference between intimidation and law. You are clearly familiar with the former. Allow me to introduce you to the latter. Those papers mean nothing. My father is the judge. Your father is the judge of this county. The territorial governor is not. The federal marshal is not. And newspaper editors are definitively not. If anyone on this property suffers harm, if any further damage occurs to livestock structures or land, those papers become front-page news by morning. Not a threat, mister. Greer, a guarantee. Emmett stood very still for a long moment, and Silas watched something he had not expected pass across the man's face. Fear. Not the dramatic, visible fear of someone confronted with physical danger, but the cold, calculating fear of someone who has just realized that the game board has changed and the pieces are no longer arranged in his favor. "This is not over," Emmett said finally. "No," Silas agreed. "It is not. But from this point forward, it will be conducted on my terms, not yours." Emmett mounted his horse, jerked the reins harder than necessary, and rode out with his men at a pace that was just fast enough to suggest retreat without admitting it. The yard was quiet after they left. Just the wind and the distant sound of the creek and the breathing of four people coming down from an adrenaline peak that had left all of them shaking. Hazel was the first to speak. She had come down from the porch and now stood behind Silas. Her rifle lowered her face, wearing an expression he had never seen on her before. "You stood in front of a man who may have killed our father," she said, "without a weapon, with paper." "Guns kill people," Silas said. His hands were trembling, and he shoved them into his pockets to hide it. "Paper kills careers. I judged that the latter was more frightening to a man like Greer." "You were right. I know. You are shaking. I know that too." That night, after Wren and Bertie had gone to bed and the fire in the main cabin had burned down to embers, Hazel found Silas sitting on the porch, staring at the mountains in the darkness. She sat down beside him. Not close, but closer than she had ever sat voluntarily. "Today you stood in front of the man I believe murdered my father," she said. "You did it without armor, without weapons, without any of the things that are supposed to make a person strong. You did it with paper and words and the most infuriating calmness I have ever witnessed. I was not calm, I was terrified. You did not show it. Showing fear to a predator is never productive." Hazel turned to look at him. Moonlight caught her face, the strong line of her jaw, the green eyes that had spent weeks looking through him and were now finally looking at him. "Silas." She used his name, and the sound of it in her voice, stripped of formality, stripped of professional distance, was different, warmer, more dangerous. "Thank you for staying, for fighting for us in your way." "I did not come here to be a signature," he said quietly. "I came because a letter told me I was needed, and I stayed because 3 women showed me what it looks like to refuse to surrender. I was wrong about you. You were cautious. There is a difference, and I respect it. No, I was wrong. I looked at you and saw weakness because I was measuring strength by the only standard I knew. Muscle and stubbornness and the ability to swing an axe. But you showed me that strength comes in other forms. Forms I was too proud and too frightened to recognize." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice held a quality Silas had never heard from her: vulnerability. "My mother loved my father, loved him so completely that when he was cruel in his younger years before the mountains softened him, she nearly broke under the weight of that love. I watched it happen. I swore I would never need anyone the way she needed him, never give anyone that kind of power over me." "I understand." "Do you? Because what I am about to say terrifies me more than Emmett Greer and his father and every threat they have made combined." Silas waited. The mountains waited. The stars turned overhead in their ancient, indifferent patterns. "I do not want this to be a contract anymore," Hazel whispered. "I do not want you sleeping in the shed. I do not want to pretend that what I feel when you walk into a room is practical convenience." She drew a breath that shook. "I am terrified, Silas, more scared than I have ever been, because needing you means you can hurt me, and I have spent my entire life making sure nobody had that power." "I would rather hurt myself than hurt you," Silas said. "I think you know that." "I know, that is what makes it so frightening. You are a good man, a genuinely good man, and I do not know what to do with that because I have never trusted one before. Then trust me one day at a time, one decision at a time, and any day you wake up and decide this is too much, you tell me, and we go back to the contract. No anger, no guilt, just honesty." Hazel reached out and took his hand. Her palm was calloused and rough against his bandaged fingers. Her grip was strong enough to crack walnuts, and the tenderness in it was the most powerful thing Silas had ever felt. "Come inside," she said. "It is cold out here, and the shed is no place for my husband to sleep." They walked into the cabin together, and the door closed softly behind them. When morning came, the light that entered the bedroom window found them changed. Not in the dramatic, shattering way of stories, but in the quiet, permanent way of two people who had decided to stop being afraid of each other. 2 weeks later, Judge Greer made his move. The territorial inspector arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning, riding a fine horse and wearing the expression of a man conducting business he found distasteful. He carried papers authorizing him to investigate the validity of the Calloway-Whitfield marriage on behalf of the county court. It should have been a disaster. 3 weeks earlier, it would have been. Silas sleeping in the shed, Hazel maintaining professional distance, a marriage that existed on paper and nowhere else. Greer had timed his attack perfectly, or so he believed. But Greer did not know about the storm on the roof, did not know about the conversation on the porch, did not know that his timeline of destruction had accidentally created the conditions for something he had never anticipated. The inspector found a married couple living in the same house. He found Silas's books on the bedside table, his shaving kit in the washroom, his clothes in the wardrobe beside Hazel's. He found a household that operated with the comfortable efficiency of people who had learned each other's rhythms. He found Hazel and Silas finishing each other's sentences over breakfast, arguing about fence placement with the passionate specificity of people who both cared deeply about the outcome, exchanging looks across the kitchen table that contained entire conversations. He also found, because Greer's lawyer had found it first, a neighbor willing to testify that Silas had been sleeping in the shed during the early weeks. The hearing took place in the Cradle Creek Church because the courthouse was too small to hold everyone who wanted to watch. Half the town turned out drawn by the spectacle of the most powerful man in the county trying to seize a dead man's ranch from his orphaned daughters. Greer's lawyer presented his case with the smooth confidence of a man who had won many such cases in rooms controlled by his patron. The neighbor testified. The evidence of separate sleeping arrangements was laid out in detail. The marriage, the lawyer argued, was a transparent fiction designed to circumvent property law. Then Silas stood up. He was not a large man. He did not have Hazel's commanding presence or Wren's quiet intensity or even Bertie's bright energy. He was a 27-year-old former school teacher with spectacles and ink-stained fingers and burn scars on his hands from pulling equipment out of a burning barn. But when he spoke, the church went silent. "I did sleep in the shed during the first weeks," he said. His voice was level and clear, carrying to every corner of the room without being raised. "Because I was a stranger and my wife needed time. That is not evidence of a false marriage. That is evidence of respect." He paused, letting the words settle. "I could describe the ways in which our marriage has become genuine. I could detail the nights we have spent talking until dawn about the future of this ranch, the mornings we have argued over coffee, about which fields to rest for winter, the evenings we have sat on the porch and watched the sun go down over mountains that have become my home. But our private life is not the court's business." He turned to the territorial inspector. "What is the court's business is this?" He opened his portfolio. "Financial records showing systematic price manipulation by Jacob Pruitt, a documented associate of Judge Greer, resulting in losses exceeding $4,000 to the Calloway Ranch alone. Property damage reports documenting 6 separate incidents of vandalism and arson, each occurring within days of visits to the area by Emmett Greer, and a sworn medical statement from Dr. Phineas confirming that Tobias Calloway's death was inconsistent with a riding accident." The church erupted. Greer's lawyer objected. The inspector called for order. And in the chaos, Silas placed his documents on the table with the calm precision of a man who had been planning this moment for weeks. Doc Phineas stood next. Old, trembling, clearly terrified, but standing nonetheless. He described the wound on Tobias's skull in clinical detail. Wrong angle for a fall, wrong depth, consistent with a deliberate blow from behind. Maggie Boone testified that she had seen Emmett Greer and 2 riders near the Calloway property on the night of the barn fire. She had not come forward earlier because she feared retaliation. She was coming forward now because, as she put it, someone finally had the guts to stand up, and it turned out to be the skinny school teacher none of us expected anything from. Then Wren spoke. Wren, who rarely said more than 10 words to anyone outside her family. Wren, who communicated through horses and silence, and the occasional gesture that carried more meaning than most people's speeches. She stood in the church and spoke with a voice that shook but did not break. My father was murdered. Our ranch has been sabotaged, our livestock poisoned, our barn burned, and the only person who fought for us was not born in these mountains. He came from Philadelphia with a suitcase of books and $47 and hands that had never held anything heavier than a pen. Her gray-blue eyes swept the congregation. He cannot ride worth a damn. He cannot split wood without bleeding. He takes an hour to do what my sister does in 10 minutes. But he stood in front of the man who killed our father with nothing but paper and the truth, and he did not back down. If you want to call that marriage fake, then you do not know what marriage is. The silence after Wren's words was the loudest thing Silas had ever heard. Louder than the storm, louder than the fire, louder than the pounding of his own heart during the confrontation with Emmett. The territorial inspector took 2 days to review the evidence. His report concluded that the marriage was valid, the property claim legitimate, and that a criminal investigation into Judge Greer and his son should be initiated immediately. The news spread through Cradle Creek like wildfire through dry timber. By the end of the week, the governor's office had dispatched federal representatives to the county. Within a month, Harlan Greer was removed from the bench. Emmett was arrested for property destruction, with the murder investigation ongoing. Jacob Pruitt's business was suspended pending review by the Cattlemen's Association, and restitution proceedings began for every rancher in the valley who had been cheated. The Callaway Ranch, battered and diminished by months of assault, was still standing. And Silas Whitfield, the gentle mail-order husband who could not split firewood or ride a horse or do any of the things the frontier demanded of men, had saved it with the weapons his enemy had been too arrogant to fear. Words, numbers, truth, and the quiet, relentless courage of a man who had spent a lifetime with nothing to lose and had finally found everything worth fighting for. That night after the inspector left, and the future felt for the first time like something other than a countdown to disaster, Hazel and Silas sat on the porch while Wren and Bertie tended to the evening chores. You changed everything, Hazel said. We changed it everything. I just did the paperwork. You stood up when it mattered. When it was dangerous, you stood up. So did you. Every day for years. You just did it with a rifle instead of a pen. She leaned against him, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder, and Silas put his arm around her. They sat like that while the sky turned from blue to gold to the deep purple of mountain twilight, and the first stars appeared over the ridgeline like promises that would be kept. I love you, Hazel said. The words came out rough, unpracticed, as if she were speaking a language she had only recently learned. I did not plan to. I did not want to. I fought against it every day for weeks. But you made it impossible not to love you, Silas Whitfield, because you showed me what it looks like when a good man keeps his word. I love you too, Silas said. I have loved you since the day you handed me a list of impossible chores and dared me to fail. I just waited until you were ready to hear it. I might never have been ready if you had pushed. I know, that is why I waited. She kissed him then, not the obligatory brush of lips at their wedding ceremony. A real kiss, deep and deliberate, and carrying the accumulated weight of weeks of resistance, finally surrendered. When they separated, Hazel's eyes were bright with something that was not tears, or was but the kind that came from opening rather than breaking. Come to bed, she said, not because of contracts or inspectors or legal requirements, because I want you there. The door closed behind them, and the mountain night settled around the cabin like a benediction. When dawn came, it found them together, and the light that entered through the window touched two people who had stopped pretending that what they were building was anything less than real. The collapse of Harlan Greer's empire did not happen in a single dramatic moment. It happened the way mountains erode slowly at first, then all at once, until what had seemed permanent and immovable was reduced to rubble that the wind could scatter. The federal investigators arrived in Cradle Creek on a gray November morning, 3 men in dark coats who carried themselves with the particular authority of people whose jurisdiction could not be overridden by county judges or territorial politics. They set up operations in the boarding house, and within 48 hours, every person in the valley who had ever been cheated, threatened, or silenced by Harlan Greer found their way to Maggie Boone's front parlor to tell their stories. There were more of them than Silas had expected. Ranchers who had sold land under pressure, merchants who had paid unofficial taxes for the privilege of operating in Greer's County, women who had been refused legal protections after their husbands died because Greer controlled the probate court and could redirect estates however he pleased. A decade of corruption poured out of Cradle Creek like water from a broken dam, and the investigators filled notebook after notebook with testimony that painted a portrait of a man who had treated an entire community as his personal property. Silas provided the framework. His meticulous documentation, the financial analysis, the timeline of incidents, the cross-referenced evidence, connecting Greer's public actions to his private profit gave the investigators the structure they needed to organize the flood of individual grievances into a coherent legal case. He spent hours in meetings with them, explaining his methodology, walking them through the accounting records, answering questions with the patient precision of a man who had been preparing for this moment since the day he found Tobias Calloway's journal hidden beneath his floor. "You should have been a lawyer," one of the investigators told him after a particularly detailed session reviewing Pruitt's fraudulent pricing schemes. "I am a teacher," Silas said. "Teachers organize information so that others can understand it. Lawyers argue about what it means. I prefer the organizing." Emmett Greer was arrested on a Tuesday, which felt appropriate since Tuesdays had become significant days in Silas's new life. His wedding had been on a Tuesday. The inspector's arrival had been on a Tuesday. Now the man who had likely murdered Tobias Calloway was led out of his father's house in handcuffs on a Tuesday, and Silas watched from across the street with Hazel beside him, her hand in his, both of them silent as the man who had terrorized their family was loaded into a wagon bound for the territorial prison. Emmett caught Silas's eye as the wagon pulled away. The arrogance was gone. In its place was something Silas recognized because he had seen it in his own mirror during the worst years at the orphanage. The look of a man who understood finally that he was alone and that no one was coming to save him. Silas felt no satisfaction. He had expected to had imagined this moment during the long nights of letter writing and evidence compilation, had pictured the vindication of seeing justice delivered to the man who had burned their barn and poisoned their water and almost certainly killed the father of the women Silas loved. But watching Emmett's face as the wagon carried him away, all Silas felt was a heavy, complicated sadness for the waste of it. 2 lives destroyed by greed, Tobias dead and Emmett imprisoned in the land that had caused it all, still sitting quiet and beautiful under the November sky, indifferent to the human dramas played out on its surface. Harlan Greer was removed from the bench the following week. The territorial governor issued the order personally, and the old judge left Cradle Creek in a private carriage, his reputation in ruins, facing criminal charges that would keep lawyers employed for years. His house, the largest in town, stood empty within a month, its windows dark, its garden going to seat a monument to the impermanence of power built on corruption. Jacob Pruitt's business was shut down, pending restitution proceedings. The Cattlemen's Association investigation confirmed what Silas's numbers had shown: systematic price manipulation affecting every small rancher in the valley. Restitution orders were issued, totaling more than $12,000, with the Calloway Ranch receiving the largest single payment of $2,800. The money arrived in the form of a bank draft that Hazel held in both hands, staring at the number as if it might change if she blinked. "That is more money than we have ever had at one time," she said. "It is money that was always yours," Silas replied. "Pruitt just held it hostage for a while." "What do we do with it?" "Rebuild the barn, properly this time with stone foundations and a metal roof that will not burn. Restock winter supplies. Set aside operating capital for next year. And invest in Wren's horse breeding program, because the numbers I have been running suggest that your sister's instincts about bloodlines could turn this ranch from surviving to prospering." Hazel looked at him with an expression that had become familiar over the past weeks, but still caught him off guard every time. Pride. Not the defensive armored pride she had worn like chainmail since the day he arrived, but something softer and warmer. Pride in him, in what they had built together, in the future she was beginning to believe they actually had. "You really do see everything in numbers, do you not? Numbers tell the truth when people lie. I learned that early and never forgot it." Winter arrived with the decisive authority of a season that did not negotiate. Snow came to the Blue Ridge Mountains in early December. Not the polite dusting that Philadelphia occasionally received, but a serious, committed snowfall that buried the ranch under 2 feet of white silence and transformed the world into something Silas had only read about in books. He stood on the porch that first morning, coffee steaming in his hands, breath crystallizing in the frigid air, and watched the sun rise over mountains that looked like they had been carved from ivory and set with diamonds where ice crystals caught the light. The beauty of it was staggering, violent almost in its perfection, the kind of beauty that made you understand why people built entire lives in places that tried to kill them half the year. First mountain winter. Hazel appeared beside him, wrapped in a heavy coat, her cheeks already pink from cold. First winter, where I have stood outside voluntarily to watch it arrive. You will be less romantic about it by February. Probably, but today it is extraordinary. She leaned against him and they watched the sunrise together, two people who had started as strangers bound by paperwork and were now bound by something considerably more durable. The winter tested them in ways the autumn crisis had not. Not through external threat, but through the relentless demands of survival, in a place where nature was neither friend nor enemy, but simply indifferent. Cattle needed feeding when snow covered the pastures. Water sources froze and had to be broken open daily. The cold found every gap in every wall and exploited it with the methodical patience of a siege army. Silas learned to function in conditions his Philadelphia existence had not prepared him for. He learned that wood stoves required constant attention and that letting the fire die at 3 in the morning meant waking to a house cold enough to freeze the water in the wash basin. He learned that hauling feed to cattle through knee-deep snow was work that left your body aching in places you did not know contained muscles. He learned that isolation could be its own kind of pressure. Weeks passing without seeing anyone outside the four of them, the world contracted to the boundaries of the ranch and the limited distance you could travel before the snow and the mountains turned you back. But he also learned other things. He learned that winter evenings by the fire with Hazel reading beside him and Wren oiling tack in the corner and Bertie writing furiously in her journal could fill him with a contentment so deep it felt like a physical warmth independent of the wood stove. He learned that waking up next to Hazel, her body warm against his in the cold bedroom, her breathing slow and steady, was a miracle he would never become accustomed to no matter how many mornings he experienced it. He learned that he could split firewood now. Not with Hazel's speed or Wren's efficiency, but competently, steadily producing respectable piles that contributed meaningfully to the household's needs. His hands had hardened the blisters replaced by calluses that would have horrified his Philadelphia landlady. His shoulders had broadened slightly from months of physical labor, and his legs trained by daily riding no longer ached after time in the saddle. He was not a mountain man. He would never be a mountain man. But he was becoming something else, something that had no established name. A hybrid of the world he had come from and the world he had chosen, carrying the analytical mind of a trained educator and the developing physical capability of a man who was learning one day at a time to belong to a place that was nothing like anywhere he had been before. Wren's horse breeding program took shape during the winter months planned in the warm kitchen while blizzards raged outside. Silas helped her organize her knowledge, the bloodlines she carried in her head, the behavioral observations she had accumulated over years of working with horses into a formal breeding plan that combined her intuitive understanding of the animals with his systematic approach to documentation and planning. "You know more about horses than anyone I have ever met or read about," Silas told her one evening, reviewing the genealogical charts they had created together. "But you keep it all in your head, which means if something happens to you, it is lost. We need it written down, preserved, shared. Who would want to read about my horses? Every rancher in the territory who wants quality stock. Wren, your instincts about breeding pairs are extraordinary. The horses you produce are healthier, calmer, and more responsive than anything available for purchase in this region. That is not just a talent, that is a business." She looked at him with her gray-blue eyes, and he watched the familiar process of an idea finding its place inside her, settling into the quiet spaces where Wren kept everything important. She was not a person of sudden revelations. She was a person of gradual absorptions, taking in new information the way the earth takes in rain slowly and completely. "You think my horses could support the ranch? I think your horses could transform the ranch. Cattle are survival. Horses are prosperity. The numbers support it. You and your numbers. The numbers do not lie. Neither do horses." She almost smiled. "Fine. Show me the plan." Bertie's writing had evolved during the winter from tentative journal entries into something more ambitious. She was working on a manuscript, a fictionalized account of their family's history that Silas recognized as potentially remarkable. The prose was raw and unpolished, full of the kind of honest, visceral detail that came from lived experience rather than imagination, and it carried an emotional power that more technically accomplished writing often lacked. He helped her edit, not imposing his own style, but refining hers, smoothing rough edges, while preserving the distinctive voice that made her writing worth reading. They worked together in the evenings after dinner, Silas marking passages with small pencil notes, and Bertie revising with the fierce concentration of someone who had discovered their purpose. "I want to send it to a publisher," she said one night, holding the growing stack of pages with reverent hands. "Is that foolish? It is ambitious. That is different from foolish. Papa always said I was the one with words, but words do not build fences or feed cattle. Words built the case that saved this ranch. Words in the form of letters and legal documents and newspaper articles. Do not underestimate what language can do, Bertie. Your father understood that. It is why he wanted someone who could write to come here." She looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Silas had been waiting for the right moment to share what he had found in Tobias's journal. The investigation was over. Greer was defeated. The secrets no longer needed to be weapons. Now they could simply be truth. He retrieved the journal from its hiding place where he had kept it since that first week and brought it to the kitchen table. All three sisters gathered around as he opened it and explained what he had found. Tobias's discovery of the copper deposits. Greer's attempts to buy the land. The increasing threats. And the final entry, the one that had changed everything Silas understood about why he was here. Hazel read the last words aloud, her voice unsteady. "Trust the outsider. Trust the man who comes with books instead of guns." She pressed the journal against her chest and closed her eyes. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire and the wind outside. When she opened her eyes, they were bright with tears she did not try to hide. "He knew," she said. "Even at the end, when everything was falling apart, he was still trying to protect us. Still planning. Still being our father." Wren took the journal from Hazel and read the final entry herself, her lips moving silently. When she finished, she looked at Silas with an expression that held no reserve, no caution, no distance. Just gratitude so deep it was indistinguishable from grief. "He sent you to us," she said. "He was already gone, but he sent you to us." "He chose you," Bertie whispered. "Papa chose you before you even knew we existed." "He chose the idea of me," Silas corrected gently. "Someone educated, someone who could fight with paper. He put out the advertisement, and after he died, you found his correspondence and continued the plan." "I did not know about the journal," Bertie said. "I found the letters from the Women's Settlement Society in his desk after the funeral. I thought he had been trying to find us a husband because he was worried about the land. I did not know about the copper or the threats or any of it. I just knew he wanted someone to come. And you wrote to me. And I wrote to you and made up a story about a lonely mountain girl looking for love because I thought that was what mail-order husbands wanted to hear. You were not entirely wrong. I was lonely. And what I wanted was exactly what you described in those letters: someone to belong to, somewhere to matter." Hazel closed the journal carefully and set it on the table. Her hand found Silas's and held it. "Papa would have liked you," she said. "He would have been confused by you at first. Probably would have handed you an axe and watched you fail for a week, same as I did. But he would have recognized what you are. And what am I? The kind of strong that does not need to advertise itself. The kind that shows up quietly and does what needs doing without asking for recognition. The kind my mother deserved and my father eventually became." The copper deposits that Tobias had discovered proved to be significant. Silas arranged for a proper geological survey conducted by professionals from the state mining office rather than Greer's pocket surveyors, and the results confirmed a vein substantial enough to be commercially viable. The sisters faced a decision. Mining would bring money but would also bring change, outsiders, disruption, the transformation of their mountain sanctuary into something louder and less peaceful. They discussed it for a week, the four of them, with the same combination of practical analysis and emotional consideration that had come to characterize all their important decisions. In the end, they chose a middle path. They leased the mining rights to a reputable company, rather than selling the mineral rights outright, retaining ownership of the land while generating income from the deposits beneath it. Silas negotiated the lease terms, his accounting skills, and legal research, producing a contract that protected the family's interests while allowing responsible extraction. "This is more money than we will ever need," Wren said, reading the projected royalty figures. "Then we use what we need and do something useful with the rest," Hazel replied. "Papa built this ranch to sustain a family. We can use the surplus to sustain a community." The idea grew organically from there, watered by Silas's experience as a teacher and Hazel's emerging sense of civic responsibility. They would build a school, not just the small ranch-based operation Silas had been running informally through the winter, teaching Bertie advanced mathematics and offering reading lessons to cowboys who stopped by, but a proper school centrally located free to any child in the valley. They chose a site halfway between the ranch and town, a pretty meadow beside the creek where wildflowers bloomed in spring and ancient oaks provided shade in summer. Construction began in March, funded by the mining royalties and built by a community that had spent years under Greer's shadow and was now discovering what cooperation felt like when it was voluntary rather than coerced. Ranchers who had never spoken to the Calloway sisters came to help raise walls. Merchants who had been complicit in Greer's schemes contributed materials as a form of atonement. Women who had whispered behind their hands at church now brought food to the construction crew and sat with Hazel planning curriculum and supply lists. Silas taught, of course. It was what he was born to do, what he had always been underneath the accounting and the legal correspondence and the quiet courage that frontier life had demanded from him. Standing in front of children, watching comprehension dawn on young faces, feeling the particular satisfaction of knowledge successfully transferred from one mind to another, this was where Silas Whitfield felt most completely himself. The school opened in April with 14 students ranging in age from 6 to 16. By summer, the number had grown to 22. By the following fall, they needed a second room and a second teacher, a young woman from Richmond named Catherine, who had answered an advertisement that Bertie placed in 3 newspapers, the same newspapers that had helped bring down Greer. Hazel served on the county council, the first woman to do so in the territory's history. Her election was not without opposition, and there were men who objected loudly to being governed by a woman who wore riding trousers and could outshoot most of them. But the opposition dissolved quickly once Hazel demonstrated the same combination of practical intelligence and iron determination that she had used to hold her ranch together through months of siege. She reformed the county court system, establishing oversight mechanisms that would prevent any future judge from accumulating the kind of unchecked power Greer had wielded. She negotiated fair pricing agreements with livestock dealers. She initiated a public works program to improve the roads connecting remote ranches to town, reducing the isolation that had made small landowners vulnerable to exploitation. "You are building something bigger than a ranch," Silas told her one evening, watching her review council documents at the kitchen table, the same table where he had first laid out his evidence against Greer. "I am building what Papa wanted, a place where people like us, people without money or connections or the right kind of power, can still thrive. Where being strong is not the only way to survive." She looked up at him. "You taught me that. You showed me that strength without cunning is just stubbornness, and cunning without principle is just what Greer did. Somewhere in between is what I am trying to build." Wren's horse breeding program exceeded even Silas's optimistic projections. Within 2 years, she had established a reputation that extended beyond the county, beyond the territory, into neighboring states where serious horsemen heard about the Calloway horses and came to see for themselves. Her animals were exceptional bred with an instinct for quality that no amount of academic study could replicate, and trained with a patience and understanding that produced horses of remarkable temperament and ability. She expanded the program with characteristic quietness, adding pasture, building a proper training facility, hiring 2 young hands who shared her philosophy of patience over force. She never became talkative. She never became the kind of public figure her sister was becoming. But in her world, the world of horses and the people who loved them, Wren Calloway was becoming a name spoken with respect. She also became unexpectedly a teacher in her own right. Young women from ranching families began seeking her out, wanting to learn her methods of horse training. Wren took them on with the same patient silence she applied to the animals themselves, letting her students learn by watching and doing rather than listening, producing a generation of horsewomen whose skills matched or exceeded those of their male counterparts. "You have created something remarkable," Silas told her during one of their evening conversations, which had become a ritual. While Hazel managed the ranch's business and civic affairs, and Bertie wrote, Silas and Wren would sit on the corral fence and watch the horses settle for the night, talking in the comfortable, unhurried way of two people who had learned each other's silences. "I have done what I always did," Wren said, "paid attention to horses. The remarkable part is that someone finally told me it mattered. It always mattered. You just needed someone to say it out loud. I needed you to say it." Bertie published her book. It appeared under the title Three Sisters and the Man Who Came with Books, a fictionalized account with altered names and certain details changed for privacy, but recognizably their story. The publisher in Richmond accepted it based on Silas's carefully crafted submission letter and Bertie's undeniable talent for narrative, and the book found an audience among women across the eastern states who recognized in the Calloway sisters' story something universal about resilience and family and the unexpected forms that salvation could take. The reviews were kind. One critic wrote that the author captured frontier life with unflinching honesty. Another noted that the male protagonist was unlike any hero typically found in Western narratives, a quiet man whose weapons were literacy and love rather than guns and grit. "They are talking about you, Kim," Bertie told Silas, showing him the reviews with barely contained delight. "They are talking about a character you created based loosely on me. There is a difference. Not as much of a difference as you think. I wrote what I saw. A man who was gentle in a world that demanded roughness and who turned out to be exactly what that world needed." The money from the book was modest but meaningful to Bertie, less for its amount than for what it represented. She was no longer just the youngest Calloway sister, the cheerful one who had written deceptive letters to lure a husband from Philadelphia. She was an author. She had a voice that reached beyond the mountains, carrying stories that mattered to people she would never meet. On the anniversary of their 5th year, Hazel woke Silas before dawn and led him outside without explanation. They rode in silence through the pre-dawn darkness, up the north trail past the creek where the copper had been found, to the highest point on the property where Tobias Calloway had carved his daughter's initials into a granite boulder years before they were born. The sun was just cresting the ridgeline when they arrived, flooding the valley below with gold. Hazel dismounted and stood at the boulder, running her fingers over the carved letters. HWB, 3 daughters he had loved enough to mark in stone. "I brought you here because I need to say something I have never said to anyone," Hazel told Silas, her voice carrying the particular steadiness of someone who has rehearsed difficult words many times. "5 years ago, I was ready to lose everything. The ranch, the land, my sister's future. I had accepted it, not happily, but the way you accept weather, as something you cannot fight. Then you arrived with your books and your bleeding hands and your absolute refusal to be what I expected, and you did not save us. You showed us how to save ourselves. There is a difference, and it matters." She pulled a small knife from her belt and knelt at the boulder. Beneath the 3 initials her father had carved, she added a 4th letter, working carefully, the blade biting into granite with patient determination. S. "You belong here now," she said, standing and brushing stone dust from her knees. "Not because of a marriage certificate or a land deed. Because my father chose you, and my sisters trust you, and I love you, and this mountain knows your name." Silas looked at the 4 letters carved in stone. HWBS. A family recorded in granite, permanent as the mountain itself. His throat closed and his eyes burned, and he did not trust himself to speak, so he simply pulled Hazel against him and held her while the sun finished rising and the valley below them came alive with light. 5 years after Silas Whitfield stepped off a train in Cradle Creek, carrying a valise full of books and $47, the world he had walked into was almost unrecognizable. The Calloway Ranch, now formally registered as Calloway and Whitfield, had grown from 400 to 600 acres, the additional land purchased from neighboring properties whose owners were selling voluntarily rather than under Greer's coercion. The cattle operation was healthy and profitable, managed with the combination of Hazel's frontier knowledge and Silas's financial discipline. The horse breeding program had become the ranch's most prestigious enterprise, with Wren's stock commanding prices that would have seemed fantastical 5 years earlier. The school had expanded twice and now served 30 children from across the valley. Silas taught mathematics and literature and history subjects that he wove together in ways that made his students see connections between numbers and stories in the events that shaped their world. He was by all accounts an extraordinary teacher, possessed of the rare ability to make complex ideas accessible without simplifying them, and to treat every student's question as worthy of serious consideration. Hazel's council work had transformed the county's governance from a one-man operation into a functioning democratic institution. She was not universally loved. Some people still resented a woman in power, still whispered that she had gotten too big for her station, still believed that the natural order placed men in positions of authority and women in positions of support. But the whispers grew quieter each year as the tangible results of her leadership laid better roads, fairer courts, a functioning school, a community that could solve its own problems without relying on a patron's questionable generosity, spoke louder than any gossip. On an autumn afternoon, 5 years after his arrival, the same kind of crisp golden afternoon that had greeted him when he first stepped onto the Cradle Creek platform, Silas stood on the porch of the cabin that Tobias Calloway had built with his own hands and watched the three women who had become his family. Hazel was in the South Meadow moving cattle with the easy authority of a woman who had spent her entire life commanding animals and landscapes. Even from this distance, he could see the confidence in her posture, the way she sat her horse, as if she and the animal shared a single nervous system. She had always been strong. What 5 years of partnership had given her was something different. Permission to be soft when she wanted to be, permission to lean on someone without feeling diminished, permission to love without treating it as a liability. Wren was in the training morral working with a young mare, her movements so subtle and patient that from a distance she appeared to be standing still while the horse moved around her in gradually tightening circles of trust. She had grown into her gifts with the quiet certainty of someone who had finally accepted that what she did was valuable. She spoke more now than she had 5 years ago, though still less than most people. She smiled more, two small smiles that transformed her weathered face and made her look briefly like the young woman she actually was. Bertie sat on the schoolhouse steps, surrounded by children, reading aloud from a book that was probably her own, though she would deny it if asked. Her auburn hair caught the sunlight the way it had that first day on the station platform, still bright, still wild, still marking her as the fire in a family of steadier elements. She was working on a second book, this one about the valley itself, its history and its people, and the complicated web of relationships that held a community together. And somewhere in the quiet between these three women, in the spaces where their lives intersected and diverged and came back together, was the architecture of everything Silas had built. Not with his hands, though his hands were calloused now and capable of work that would have seemed impossible 5 years ago. Not with his strength, though his body had adapted to frontier demands in ways his Philadelphia self would not have recognized, but with the particular tools he had always possessed and that Tobias Calloway, in his final desperate wisdom, had known would be needed. Patience, attention, the ability to see what was really there rather than what was expected to be there, and love the steady, unspectacular, daily kind of love that showed up when it was needed and did not require applause. He thought about the train ride from Philadelphia, the 3 days of rattling uncertainty moving toward a future he could not imagine, carrying $47 and a heart so hungry for belonging that it had answered a stranger's advertisement on the strength of a beautiful letter. He thought about arriving to find not one woman, but three, all of them armed, none of them pleased to see him, the tallest one telling him he was there to be a signature and nothing more. The memories came without order. Splitting firewood until his hands bled, sleeping in a converted shed while his wife slept in the house, Wren comparing him to a frightened horse and meaning it as the highest compliment she knew how to give. Bertie's guilt and Hazel's walls and the slow, painstaking process of earning trust from people who had every reason to withhold it. He remembered Emmett Greer's face when Silas walked into the yard with nothing but paper. The storm on the roof when he held Hazel's belt and refused to let go. Wren sitting beside him in the stable with her dead horses, holding his hand in silence. Tobias Calloway's journal and the dead man's faith in a stranger he would never meet. And he remembered all the moments when he could have quit, when the work was too hard, when the people were too cold, when the danger was too real, when every rational calculation said that a former schoolteacher from Philadelphia had no obvious place on a mountain ranch in Virginia, yet had found his way into the heart of everything that mattered here. He could have quit. He could have taken his $47 and his valise full of books and gotten back on the train and returned to a life that was small and safe and fundamentally empty. He could have accepted that the beautiful letters were fiction and that the reality they concealed was too difficult and too foreign for a man of his background and temperament. But he had not quit. Because somewhere between the first blistered hand and the last page of testimony, between the first hostile stare and the final kiss on the porch at sunset, Silas Whitfield had discovered something that a life defined by solitude had not prepared him for. Home was not a place. It was not four walls and a roof and a warm fire, though those things mattered. Home was the decision to stay when staying was hard. Home was the choice to fight for people who had not asked for your help and did not initially want it. Home was the daily, unglamorous act of showing up and doing the work and trusting that over time consistency would accomplish what force and charm could not. Home was Hazel's hand in his, calloused and strong. Home was Wren's nod of approval when he finally rode without looking like a man in quiet disagreement with his own horse. Home was Bertie reading her words aloud and watching faces light up with recognition. Home was this porch, this view, these mountains that had tested him in every way possible and had judged him finally worthy of belonging. Hazel rode back from the meadow and dismounted in the yard, her movements fluid with the ease of a lifetime in the saddle. She looked up at Silas on the porch, and something passed between them that did not require language. 5 years of shared crisis, in quiet evenings, in arguments about fence placement, in mornings waking up together in a bed they had earned the right to share. All of it communicated in a single glance across 30 feet of mountain air. "Why are you standing there?" she asked, climbing the steps. "Watching my wife." "Watch faster. There is work to do." But she smiled, and he smiled. And the mountains rose around them, vast and indifferent and beautiful, holding in their ancient stone the story of a man who came with books instead of guns, and 3 women who taught him that the strongest thing a person can do is let someone in. Wren brought the young mare in from the corral as evening shadows began to lengthen across the valley. She passed the porch where Silas and Hazel sat and paused long enough to rest her hand briefly on Silas's shoulder. The gesture said everything her voice did not. "I am glad you stayed. I am glad you are here. I am glad my father was right about what we needed." Bertie came up from the schoolhouse with children scattering behind her like birds released from a cage, their laughter carrying across the meadow in the particular way that children's laughter carries light and weightless and full of a future that has not yet learned to be afraid. She waved at Silas and Hazel on the porch, her face bright with the satisfaction of a day spent doing work that mattered. And Silas Whitfield, gentle mail-order husband, stood on the porch of a house he had helped save, surrounded by a family he had helped build, in a community he had helped free and understood, with absolute clarity that every moment of his life, every lonely year in the orphanage, every quiet evening in his Philadelphia room, every rejection and every disappointment, and every morning he had woken up wondering if belonging to someone was something that happened to other people, but would never happen to him. All of it had been leading here, not to a ranch in the mountains of Virginia, not to copper deposits or legal battles or horse breeding programs, but to the discovery that the thing he had been searching for his entire life, the thing he had answered a newspaper advertisement hoping to find, was not a person or a place or a circumstance. It was the willingness to be needed, the courage to be gentle in a world that confused gentleness with weakness, the faith that showing up day after day with nothing but honesty and effort and a stubborn refusal to quit could transform strangers into family and a converted shed into a home. The sun went down behind the Blue Ridge Mountains, painting the sky in colors that had no names in any language Silas knew. The first stars appeared. The air grew cold with the particular sharpness of autumn evenings at altitude. Inside the cabin, lamplight glowed through windows that Silas had helped repair, illuminating a kitchen where 4 people would soon sit down together for a meal prepared with ingredients grown on land they had fought to keep. Hazel stood and stretched her joints, popping in the cold air. "Coming inside, Bertie made that stew you like, the one with the rosemary. Bertie can cook now." Silas raised his eyebrows. She read a book about it. "Apparently, that is how Whitfields learn everything." She held out her hand. "Come on, school teacher. Your family is waiting." He took her hand, calloused palm against calloused palm, a connection that had been earned through blisters and burns and the slow accumulation of trust. They walked inside together and the door closed behind them, and the mountain night settled over the ranch with the gentle authority of a world that had finally arranged itself correctly. In the morning, there would be cattle to tend, and horses to train, and children to teach, and council business to manage, and a second book to write, and 1,000 small tasks that composed the daily reality of a life built from scratch by four people who had started with nothing but stubbornness and need. But tonight there was warmth and lamplight, and the sound of four voices tangling together over dinner, arguing and laughing and planning and existing in the particular harmony of people who had chosen each other deliberately and would go on choosing each other day after day through whatever the mountains and the years decided to send their way. Silas Whitfield had come to Cradle Creek with a valise full of books and $47 in a heart so hungry for belonging that it ached like a broken bone. He had found three mountain women who needed a signature and discovered that what they actually needed, what they had always needed, was someone brave enough to stay. He stayed, and everything that mattered grew from that single quiet act of courage.